With this week's lecture, we are going to continue on a thread and a theme that we've been discussing throughout the semester, really. And that is this idea of what is history and how is history presented. In terms of what is history, we're going to continue on this theme of what historiography is all about. And that is this notion that history is not static. I mean, obviously, things happen in the past, and there's no denying that. But what is not static is the interpretation of these historical events. Again, that is what historiography is all about. But at the same time, in this lecture, we're also going to show and discuss how historiography is presented to the public. And as a result, as we already saw in last week's lecture, publicly with the fiasco controversy over the Enola Gay exhibit, and in previous semesters, the debates within academia between professors, history professors, over the meaning of history, this is never a cut and dried thing. And that's why I titled this lecture for this week, The Never-Ending History Wars. When we see this notion again, how this clash between the past and the present play out in the discussion and presentation of history. We're going to begin with this slide here where I sort of ask a question. Was the 1619 project that we are going to discuss, I'll give you some background here in a second, was it an example of public history run amok? And as we're discussing this, what we are going to see is sort of an interesting dynamic at play here. A point of comparison. So last week, if you remember, we were talking about the Enola Gay controversy, and in doing so, I made a point to highlight how the exhibitors, or the exhibit itself that was being presented at the Smithsonian Institute, was grounded in historical research. The Smithsonian officials had actually turned to historians to create this story. Now, again, after that, of course, you'd have the public intervene, particularly U.S. veterans and conservative politicians and various groups, and that would lead to some problems. But in the case of this week's focus on the 1619 project, we will see, in fact, that historians are sort of left out of it early on here, and that will cause some issues, as we'll see. But nonetheless, the background, as promised. In August of 2019, the New York Times Magazine published a special issue titled simply The 1619 Project. Now, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, this is the image that is on the front page of this New York Times Magazine. It is a photograph of the sea in the background. And what this is meant to represent is essentially the shores of the United States in 1619. But more importantly, underneath that, it includes a quote. And it is a quote that I have here on the screen. In August 1619, a ship appeared on this horizon near Point Comfort, a coastal port in the British colony of Virginia. It carried more than 20 enslaved Africans who were sold to the colonists. America was not yet America, but this was the movement it began. This was the moment, this was the moment it began. A little mix up on the wording there, but this was the moment it began. This is key. This phrasing right here, and that's why I apologize for making this error here. This was the moment it began. This is when America began here in 1619. Because, in other words, the 1619 project contended that, quote, the country's true birth date, as the lead editorial explained, was 1619, not 1776. Of course, 1776 being the acceptance in July of 1776 of the Declaration of Independence. So with this bold assertion that the nation's founding was not in 1776, but rather when the first slaves arrived in 1619, Nicole Hannah-Jones, a journalist at the New York Times, she's pictured on the above right-hand corner of this slide, she launched the opening salvo of a large-scale public history project that created controversy both in and out of the academic world. Because again, here you are essentially saying that the foundation, the cornerstone, the bedrock of America was slavery when the first slaves arrived on the shores of the New World, if you will, in 1619. Well, what we are going to see is the history wars begin quite quickly, because the counteroffensive would come some 4 months later, with a letter from 5 heavyweights of the historical profession: Victoria Bynum, James McPherson, James Oakes, Sean Willens, and Gordon S. Wood. For you history majors in this class, you might have read articles or chapters or even a whole book from these individuals. These are truly the sort of founding figures in late 20th century U.S. history. They are well known. They are very powerful. They are very influential. So to have them stake out this ground that we are going to see in a second to contest what is said in the 1619 Project, it caught a lot of people's attention, in other words. So nonetheless, we write as historians to express our strong reservations about important aspects of the 1619 Project, is how this letter began. They expressed concern over the fact that, quote, the project is intended to offer a new version of American history in which slavery and white supremacy become the dominant organizing themes. Now here's the thing. All of these authors, particularly James Oakes, but all of them understood, quote, the enduring centrality of slavery and racism to our history. But at the same time, it wasn't so much that as the fact that they found in their words, quote, factual errors that went beyond issues of, quote, interpretation or framing. So this is extremely important here, and this is why I bring it up, because we've talked about this in the past, especially when we got into this idea of different understandings of how history is portrayed. This idea that there's simply just different interpretive frameworks, whether it's because new evidence is around, whether it's because we're in a different period in history where morals and ethics have changed and perspectives have changed. But the fact is, here in December of 2019, these prominent historians are claiming that that's not what their anger is directed towards or about, but rather they're saying it is actually factual errors. It is actually factual errors that they are concerned about here. So what we are going to see is not only the fact that these errors exist, these factual errors exist, but rather as well, these errors stem from, in the minds and in the words of these historians, from, quote, a displacement of historical understanding by ideology. So here we see also another common weapon used by historians, and that is the fact that what these authors of the 1619 Project were doing was they were not relying on evidence. They were actually making statements and bold claims contrary to the evidence. And the reason why, according to these 5 prominent authors, was because of, again, ideology. They are allowing ideology to override the supposed to be objective stance of any historian, public or academic or otherwise. And that was the problem that these historians had. Now, interestingly enough, in this letter, this is obviously targeted towards the entire 1619 Project, but there was one piece of evidence in particular that really rubbed these historians the wrong way, and that was the following sentence. And what this comes from is the introductory essay, which was written by Nikole Hannah-Jones, where she declared that, quote, one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. Think about this for a second. She is basically arguing with this statement here in the 1619 Project that the whole reason for the U.S. Declaration of Independence from Great Britain in 1776 was for the protection of slaves. Now, a lot of this had to do with the fact that Great Britain during this time was moving towards the abolition of slavery within its own country, and they were even making promises when the American colonists began to rise up. They were making promises to North American slaves that if you fought for the British against the Americans, we will free you. So there is definitely some truth to this. But the idea that, again, independence was not for the fight for independence was not for those lofty goals of freedom, democracy, so on and so forth, but rather was to actually preserve and protect slavery, was just amazing in the minds of these critics. that someone could make this claim. And what the interesting thing is, though, of course, is that this wasn't necessarily new in the historical field. Because think about this, going back to earlier in the semester, if you remember, we talked about a historian by the name of Charles Beard. More than a century earlier, we would see Charles Beard make a charge that the founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence and fought for freedom from Great Britain, not because of these same lofty ideals that I just mentioned, freedom, democracy, Republican ideals, but rather for economic self-gain. This is something similar here in the 1619 Project. It's not so much about money, but it is about race. But nonetheless, regardless of whether it is about money or whether it is about race, the 1619 Project, like Charles Beard's earlier claims, sullied the reputation of the Founding Fathers, which most definitely rubbed certain historians the wrong way. In response to such criticisms, particularly pertaining to this one sentence that I just talked about a few seconds ago, a minute or so ago, we would see that Hannah-Jones did in fact change the sentence in reprints of the special issue and in a later subsequent book that was published that sort of enlarged on this magazine project. But here's what it read. Some of the colonists. Basically, again, sort of saying slavery was big in the eyes of some colonists and explains why they accepted and supported independence. But nonetheless, again, this is the idea. What was the American Revolution all about? Was it about freedom, democracy, and Republican ideals, or was it about, again, the preservation and protection of slavery? The 1619 Project argued that it was the latter, and prominent historians, including the 5 that I mentioned, they believed it was the former. On this slide, what I'd like to do is provide a little bit of my own analysis, because obviously one of the things I probably should have mentioned at the top of this lecture is the fact that we're talking about stuff that is obviously happening very recently here, within the past 5 years. So as a result, there's not been a lot written from a historical perspective. Usually history is obviously written 10, 15, 20 years or more later, when more and more evidence is possible of the primary sources, if you will. So I'm going to do a little bit of analysis here and talking about why we see so many historians criticize the 1619 Project. And I would argue that a lot of it had to do with the notion that this public history was being presented by a non-historian. This was a journalist. Remember, Nikole Hannah-Jones was a journalist. She was not a professionally trained historian that had carried out archival research. And as a result, I think this, to use a phrase that I used earlier, this rubbed a lot of historians in the wrong way. And we see this in some of the arguments proposed and made by those historians, including one that I mentioned previously who signed that letter in December of 2019. And that was, or excuse me, yeah, December of 2019, that was the guy we see in the top left hand of this corner, a guy by the name of James Oakes, the historian previously referred to. He would provide more in-depth analysis of the 1619 Project in the fall of 2021. And in doing so, he wrote that, quote, collaboration was discarded by journalists who arrogantly dismissed any historians who raised substantive objectives. The multiplicity, the quote, multiplicity of perspectives was gone, supplanted by an ideologically driven narrative. So here we see, from the horse's mouth, if you will, James Oakes complaining that the journalist, Nikole Hannah-Jones, never reached out. She never asked for the ideas of historians who had studied this for decades. These are elder historians, if you will. They had been around and in the academy for decades. And you can see in statements like this that they were a bit angry that this woman here, with, again, no official training in history, was making these statements without any cooperation from and with historians. And as a result, we would see the idea once again that the 1619 Project did not produce a strenuously researched sort of written history, but rather it was driven by ideology and to create a good story, narrative. That is a complaint made here by James Oakes. Well, interestingly enough, Oakes took issue with the assertion at the center of the 1619 Project that most Americans did not fully grasp the significance of that year. Of this claim, he asked the following question: what did it say about the thousands of students who for decades listened to our lectures expounding on the meaning of 1619, or who read about 1619 in their U.S. history books? In short, what this statement is saying here, what this quote from James Oakes is saying, is that this is old news. Why is it front page story in this New York Times magazine? Why do they have an entire special issue devoted to it? We historians, we professional historians, have been saying this stuff for decades in our lectures to thousands of students who read it also in their textbooks, and the public who reads in our books that we've written about 1619 being important. Now, this is true. And again, that is something that we've talked about throughout this course, whether it be Howard Zinn or whether it be any other historian. Those historians who are popular historians, who reach the wider public, they often take some of this specialized research and they present it to the public. That's what makes them unique. Their writing styles are able to grab the public's attention, which isn't always the case with these academic historians, these professionally trained historians like James Oakes. And that, in fact, is the argument that I want to make here, because an outside observer might question how much even those Americans who attended college and received these lectures and who read these books, how much they actually remember. So this is why I put the question here: are college students good note takers? Because how many college students actually first of all, do the reading, not to be cynical here, but actually do the reading and take notes, and not only that, years later actually still have those notes or memories of what they read in these books. So what I'm kind of proposing here is there's kind of an element of sour grapes. You have these professional historians who, again, have been doing this for decades. They weren't getting the acclaim that Nikole Hannah-Jones was getting and the 1619 Project was getting, so therefore they made this argument that this was, again, ideologically driven. This story that was being told by these people who have sort of hijacked what these scholars have been teaching, and not only that, but then present it in a way that includes a lot of errors and non-factual information. So what I'd like to do now, though, is I want to point to a different crowd that also begins to object to the 1619 Project, and that is conservative politicians. Like we saw with the Enola Gay Project and the exhibit that took place at the Smithsonian, we see here again conservative politicians rise up in anger against the 1619 Project. And we're going to begin our story here at the national level with Senator Tom Cotton, who was a Republican from the state of Arkansas. In July 2020, he proposed legislation to ban all U.S. schools from using the materials that were made available as part of the 1619 Project. Ultimately, however, these efforts failed at the national level. So therefore, early the following year, in 2021, state legislators in Arkansas, Iowa, and Mississippi introduced legislation in their states to prohibit teachers from using the 1619 Project as well. The Arkansas and Mississippi bills claimed that the 1619 Project represented, quote, a racially divisive and revisionist account. There that word is, used as a dirty word here again, that idea of revisionism as a bad thing, again, because the public does not understand that history itself is all about revision. That's what it is. Again, going back to the first class of the semester about what historiography is, if there was no revision, there would not be a need for hundreds, if not thousands of books on Abraham Lincoln, on Adolf Hitler, on Joseph Stalin. But again, that's what is at the center of history. But again, as well, most of the public doesn't realize that, and that's why we see a quote like this. The Iowa bill, for its part, argued that the 1619 Project, quote, attempts to deny or obfuscate the fundamental principles upon which the United States was founded. And this is basically in reference to the fact that, again, America was built as a democracy where all men are created equal. basically the 1619 Project was saying, no, the foundation of our society, again, was on slavery when those first slaves arrived in 1619. So eventually, what we are going to see is, as all this is going on, the President of the United States during this time, Donald Trump, is going to step in, and he is going to put in his own 2 cents, if you will. Because what happens is, on October 6th of 2020, Trump announced the creation for the following month of the 1776 Commission. This 1776 Commission would, in his words, combat, quote, anti-American historical revisionism. There that word is again, revisionism. And, quote, critical race theorists through, quote, patriotic education. So we see here an effort to create, in other words, a patriotic history, which is another loaded phrase that we've talked about previously, how people like Howard Zinn have attempted to overcome that patriotic history by talking about some of the struggles that have been taking place. How we saw radical historians going against consensus history. Very similar dynamic here. Well, regardless, days before Trump left office in January 2021, his commission, the 1776 Commission, released its report. Now, to be clear, by this point, Joseph Biden was now president, and he would actually cancel the commission. Nonetheless, the report offers a glimpse into what patriotic history looked like for its conservative authors. So I want to focus on one issue in particular, their discussion, the 1776 report's discussion of the modern civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. Though applauding the civil rights movement for overturning Jim Crow laws and white supremacy, the report goes on to say the following, quote, the civil rights movement was almost immediately turned to programs that ran counter to the lofty ideals of the founders of the United States. And as you can see here, it also criticized the movements for its, quote, abandonment of non-discrimination and equal opportunity in favor of group rights, not unlike those advanced by John C. Calhoun and his followers. Again, I imagine that the majority, if not all of you, are history majors in this class. John C. Calhoun, of course, one of the main defenders of the right of Southerners to hold slaves. So here we see this 1776 report actually criticizing the civil rights movement for being as hard-headed and racist, essentially, a form of reverse racism here, as John C. Calhoun was in the 19th century. In short, identity politics, or this idea of groups' rights in the quote that I gave you, identity politics is equated to racism. The report sees identity politics as anathema to the notion of we the people, a united singular people entity. Now, not surprisingly, in this 1776 report, no evidence is provided to actually back up these baseless claims. So at the end of the day, we see professional historians, we see conservative politicians railing against the 1619 report and its project. But I will argue that the 1619 Project, in fact, gets the last laugh, because despite such criticisms from academics and politicians alike, first of all, it received a Pulitzer Prize. Now, not for history, but for commentary in 2020. A Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2020 was given to the editors of the 1619 Project. Even more recently, last year in 2023, the streaming service Hulu launched a 6-part documentary based on the 1619 Project. So at the end of the day, we see again here this clash between popular history, public history, whatever you want to call it, and traditional history, and how politics comes to play a role in this, all in this issue surrounding what is history. And that is a question that hopefully you have a better understanding and are more capable of answering as this semester now comes to an end.